A little girl whispers, "She hugs you when I'm gone." Millionaire checks the camera footage. Before we begin, subscribe if you know tenderness can break walls. Enjoy the story. The evening light filtered through the Rivers mansion windows as 8-year-old Ellie curled in an oversized leather chair, watching her adoptive father Julian work at his desk. 8 months of living here, and she still felt like a visitor in someone else's life. The social workers called her lucky, a millionaire tech entrepreneur willing to adopt an older child. But Ellie had learned that luck and love weren't the same thing. "Mrs. Kessler will be here tomorrow," Julian said, his voice gentle but uncertain. "She's really helping you adjust, don't you think?" Ellie nodded, though something twisted in her stomach. Brianna Kessler, the school psychologist, had been coming for 2 months. All the adults said she was wonderful, but children see differently. They notice spaces between words, smiles that don't reach eyes, voices that change when no one important is listening. Julian patted the couch beside him, their awkward attempt at bonding that felt more like performance than connection. Ellie climbed down, clutching her teddy bear Leo. "Tell me about your day," Julian said, words careful and practiced. Ellie wanted to share real things, the girl who'd shared cookies, her notebook stories, dancing shadows in her room. But the words felt too precious to risk. "It was good," she said instead. Julian's relieved smile suggested he'd passed a test he hadn't studied for. He smoothed her dark hair with gentle but unpracticed movements. "Mrs. Kessler says you're making progress. Soon this will really feel like home." The word home hung between them like a question neither could answer. Outside, stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Mrs. Sylvia prepared dinner with quiet efficiency. It was peaceful in a house that had known too little peace. But Ellie, with deep childhood intuition, felt something shift in the shadows. She hugged the teddy bear named Leo tighter and whispered a prayer that tomorrow would be different, not knowing that different wasn't always better. Children see things, adults miss. Let's discover what Ellie saw that would change everything. Dinner had been quieter than usual. Julian picked at his salmon while Ellie arranged vegetables into careful piles, a habit from when she'd had to make meals last. Mrs. Sylvia moved between kitchen and dining room with silver hair catching chandelier. Light Brianna had stayed late for Ellie's session, emerging with her radiant smile. She'd hugged Julian goodbye, professional warmth between colleagues working for Ellie's well-being. "Ellie's making wonderful progress," Brianna had said, her hand lingering on Julian's arm. "She's finally starting to trust." Julian felt grateful. Parenting felt like navigating blindfolded, and Brianna's guidance was his lifeline. She understood Ellie when his words felt clumsy. "Dad?" Ellie's voice was barely audible. "Yes, sweetheart." She climbed into his lap, something she rarely did. Julian's heart tightened as her small body settled against his chest. This felt real, spontaneous, unforced. Ellie lifted her head, looking directly into his eyes with knowing that came from surviving things children shouldn't survive. "She hugs you when I'm gone," she whispered. The words hit like cold water. "What? Who?" Ellie pointed toward the study. "Mrs. Kessler. She hugs you different when I'm not watching." Julian's stomach dropped. "Sweetheart, Mrs. Kessler is helping us. Sometimes adults hug when working together." But something nagged at him. Had Brianna's touches become more frequent? Had goodbye hugs become something more? Ellie studied his face with 2 old eyes. "I know the difference. I've seen all kinds of hugs, scary hugs, lying hugs, the kind that take things away." The innocence in her voice made the words devastating. Julian realized his daughter had learned to read adult deception before learning to read books. "I'm not supposed to notice things," Ellie said, climbing down. "Mrs. Kessler says, noticing too much makes me anxious. She says I should focus on happy thoughts instead." Something cold settled in Julian's chest. "Mrs. Kessler told you that?" "She says lots of things when you're not there. She says if I tell you, you might not want me anymore because I'm the kind of kid who makes up stories." The words hit like a physical blow. Ellie was already walking toward the stairs, her moment of openness closing like a door. Julian sat alone, Brianna's words echoing. She's finally starting to trust. But trust whom? And what had his daughter been trying to trust him with? For the first time since Brianna started coming, Julian felt doubt take root. It was small, easily explained away, but it was there. And doubt grows in dark spaces where we keep our fears. In the kitchen, Mrs. Sylvia quietly loaded the dishwasher, moving slower than usual. She'd heard every word, and the tightness around her eyes suggested she was remembering things she'd chosen not to see. Children don't have the luxury of politeness when safety is at stake, and Ellie Rivers was simply a child who'd learned to watch, listen, and speak truth even when no one wanted to hear it. Julian barely slept, Ellie's words circling like persistent flies. She hugs you when I'm gone. The phrase had weight he couldn't shake. He found Ellie in the kitchen, already dressed, carefully spreading peanut butter in perfect strokes. Mrs. Sylvia moved around her with practiced efficiency. "Morning, sweetheart," Julian said, coffee tasting like ash. Ellie looked up, studying his face. "You didn't sleep good?" "Well," he corrected automatically, then felt foolish. "You didn't sleep well," Ellie repeated, but her small smile said she'd known the correct way and was testing whether he was listening. Mrs. Sylvia set down Julian's breakfast with unnecessary force. Perhaps if certain people weren't keeping others up with late-night worry sessions. Julian caught her meaningful look. "Ellie, yesterday you mentioned seeing Mrs. Kessler and me hugging. Can you tell me more?" Ellie's hand stilled. She glanced at Mrs. Sylvia, who nodded encouragingly. "You really want to know?" "I really want to know." She took a deep breath. "Last week, after my session, you thought I went to bed, but I forgot Leo and came back." Julian's coffee grew cold as she spoke. "You were on the couch and Mrs. Kessler was really close, like when people on TV sit before they kiss. She was holding your hand and talking quiet and you looked sad. She was stroking your hair like Mom used to do when I had nightmares." The comparison to her biological mother hit Julian like a punch. Ellie rarely mentioned her first mom. What was she saying? Ellie concentrated. Something about how hard it is to be alone. How taking care of me was making you tired. How you deserved someone who understood you better. Each word fell like stones into still water. Julian remembered that night. He'd been exhausted and Brianna had stayed late to help him process feelings. She'd been understanding, supportive, offering comfort he hadn't realized he'd been craving. But through Ellie's eyes, that moment looked different. Predatory. Calculated. "There was another time," Ellie continued, voice growing smaller. "I woke up because I heard voices. When I looked from the stairs, Mrs. Kessler was hugging you by the front door, but it was the long kind. The kind that means something." Mrs. Sylvia had gone very still. "I watched for a while. I know I'm not supposed to spy, but something felt wrong. She kept touching your face and whispering things that made you lean closer." Julian's memory supplied details Ellie couldn't see. How lost he'd felt. How Brianna's unexpected visit had felt like a lifeline. She'd brought wine and comfort food, saying she'd sensed his struggle. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Ellie's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Because Mrs. Kessler said you might not believe me. She said kids from foster care make up stories because they're scared of being sent away. She said if I told you things that weren't true, you might think I was too much trouble." The manipulation was subtle, perfectly crafted. Brianna had silenced Ellie by using her deepest fear, abandonment that lived in every foster child's heart. Mrs. Sylvia set down the coffee pot with controlled force. "Well, it seems Mrs. Kessler has quite a lot to say when certain people aren't around." Julian looked between his daughter and assistant, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. These two women had been trying to protect him from something they'd seen coming. "Ellie, I want you to know something important. Nothing you could ever tell me would make me want to send you away. Nothing. You're my daughter, and that's forever." Ellie nodded, but doubt remained in her eyes. Trust, once broken, was rebuilt one truth at a time. And Mrs. Sylvia, I have a feeling you've noticed things too. The older woman straightened. I've noticed quite a lot, Mr. Rivers. The question is whether you're ready to hear it. As Ellie finished breakfast, Julian realized his controlled world was about to shift unpredictably. But for the first time since bringing Ellie home, he felt like they might be moving toward something real, a family built on truth instead of careful politeness. The pieces are forming a heartbreaking picture. But Ellie and Mrs. Sylvia aren't finished. Mrs. Sylvia had always prided herself on being observant. 67 years had taught her to notice details others missed, voice changes when people lied, atmosphere shifts when something wasn't right, the difference between genuine warmth and practiced charm, which was why she'd started paying attention to the security system. The house had cameras throughout main areas, necessary security for Julian's wealth and profile. As his assistant, Mrs. Sylvia had access for coordinating staff and ensuring safety. She'd noticed occasional gaps in coverage, brief periods where the living room camera showed no feed. Initially, she'd attributed them to technical glitches, but glitches didn't happen with such convenient timing. 3 days after Ellie's breakfast confession, Mrs. Sylvia stayed late again. Julian was in his study with budget projections, and Ellie was supposedly doing homework upstairs. In reality, Ellie had become expert at moving silently through the house. Foster care taught invisibility during grown-up conversations. She'd heard Mrs. Sylvia muttering about camera footage and crept downstairs to investigate. Mrs. Sylvia? Ellie's whisper from the doorway made the older woman jump. Child, you nearly gave me a heart attack. What are you doing here? It's past bedtime. I heard you talking about cameras. Are you trying to see the things I told Dad about? Mrs. Sylvia studied the little girl's determined face. I might be, but it's probably nothing, sweetheart. Can I help? I know about computers. My last foster mom let me use hers sometimes. Well, I suppose 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. They made an unlikely team, the silver-haired assistant and the small girl with braided hair. Mrs. Sylvia pulled up the security interface while Ellie watched with intense focus. See here, Mrs. Sylvia pointed to timestamps. These show when the living room camera went offline, brief gaps, usually evenings. Ellie leaned closer, tracing patterns. They're always after my sessions with Mrs. Kessler. Look, every Tuesday and Thursday, right after she's supposed to leave. The observation was matter-of-fact, clearly stated, sending chills down Mrs. Sylvia's spine. The system automatically backs up to a secondary server, Mrs. Sylvia continued, clicking through menus. Julian insisted on redundancy after a break-in attempt. If someone tampered with the main feed, the backup would still have everything, Ellie finished, eyes bright with understanding. Exactly. They worked in silence, scrolling through hours of mundane footage. Then they found it. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m. 2 weeks prior. The main camera showed a 43-minute gap, but the backup showed everything. Brianna and Julian sat on the sofa, closer than any professional relationship warranted. Brianna's hand rested on Julian's thigh as she leaned into him, stroking his hair with intimate calculation. Julian looked exhausted, vulnerable, younger than his 33 years. They couldn't hear conversation, but could see Brianna's lips moving constantly, her body language calculated and predatory. When Julian tried pulling back, she would touch his face or move closer, maintaining contact that kept him off balance. She's hunting him, Ellie whispered with wisdom beyond her years. Like the mean lady at my second foster home. She was always touching Mr. Patterson like that, making him think he needed her. Then she took all his money and left. Mrs. Sylvia's heart broke. How much had this child seen? How many adult betrayals had she witnessed? They found more footage. Brianna arriving after hours with wine and takeout, staying past reasonable boundaries. Each visit followed the same pattern: intimate positioning, constant physical contact, Julian growing more dependent. The most damaging footage came from 3 days ago. Brianna stood in the foyer after another late session, arms wrapped around Julian in what could only be described as a lover's embrace. Her lips were close to his ear, whispering urgently. Julian's expression shifted from confusion to longing, and when she pulled away, his hands lingered on her waist. "That's when I saw them," Ellie said quietly. "From the stairs. I knew it was wrong, but didn't know how to explain it." Mrs. Sylvia's composure cracked. "Oh, sweetheart. You've been carrying this alone, haven't you?" Ellie nodded, tears spilling over. "I was scared Dad would choose her instead of me. In my other homes, grown-ups always picked other grown-ups. Kids are just extra." Mrs. Sylvia pulled Ellie into her arms with fierce protectiveness. "Listen carefully. You are not extra. You are not a burden. You are the best thing that ever happened to that man upstairs, even if he's too confused to see it. And we're going to make sure he sees it." "How?" "We're going to save every bit of this evidence. And we're going to make sure your father understands that being good doesn't mean being foolish." They worked another hour, copying files with meticulous care. By the time they finished, they had a complete picture of Brianna's manipulation, a months-long campaign to isolate Julian emotionally, while positioning herself as his savior. As Mrs. Sylvia tucked Ellie into bed, the little girl looked up with eyes holding both fear and hope. "Do you think Dad will believe us?" "I think your father loves you more than he knows how to say. And sometimes love just needs help seeing clearly." But even speaking reassuring words, Mrs. Sylvia wondered if love would overcome the careful web Brianna had woven around Julian's heart. Professional manipulation was powerful, especially when it fed on loneliness and genuine need. Still, they had truth on their side. And sometimes, if you're brave and careful, truth is enough to set everyone free. The confrontation came sooner than Mrs. Sylvia hoped, and later than Ellie could bear. For 2 days, their discovery pressed against the little girl's chest like a secret too big for her small body. She watched Julian interact with Brianna during Thursday sessions, saw his eyes light up when the psychologist praised his progress as a father, witnessed subtle touches that seemed caring but felt possessive. The breaking point came Friday evening. Julian had been working late, stress from contract negotiations leaving him drained and vulnerable, when Brianna arrived for an emergency session to help Ellie process difficult emotions from school. Julian was grateful for her dedication. He never questioned why emergencies always happened when he was most exhausted. Ellie had been in her room when she heard Brianna's voice drift up from the study. But instead of the warm professional tone from official sessions, this voice was different, honeyed and intimate. She crept to the stairs, bare feet silent on thick carpet, and listened to words confirming her worst fears. "You're pushing yourself too hard, Julian," Brianna was saying, voice filled with artificial concern. "Taking on a traumatized child while building your company, it's affecting your judgment. I just want to do right by her." Julian's voice sounded hollow. "But sometimes I feel like I'm failing at everything." "You're not failing. You're trying to be everything to everyone." "But Ellie..." "Julian, I need honesty. Her progress has stalled. She's becoming more withdrawn, suspicious. The attachment issues are worse than I initially assessed." Ellie's hands gripped the banister until knuckles went white. Withdrawn? Suspicious? She'd been trying so hard to open up, to trust, to be the daughter Julian deserved. "What are you saying?" Julian asked. "Perhaps Ellie needs more intensive intervention than I can provide at home. There are excellent residential programs for children with severe attachment disorders. It might be kindest if..." "No." The word burst from Ellie's lips before she could stop it. She stood at the stairs, small frame trembling. "No, she's lying." Julian appeared in the doorway, face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. "Ellie, sweetheart, we're having a private conversation. You need to go to your room." But Ellie was done being quiet, done being careful, done letting adults make decisions about her life without her voice. She raced downstairs, pajama feet sliding. On marble. "She's lying, Dad. She doesn't want to help me. She wants to get rid of me so she can have you." Brianna appeared behind Julian, face arranged in professional concern mixed with hurt disappointment. "Oh, sweetheart. I know this is hard to hear, but this kind of accusation is exactly what I was discussing. The paranoid thinking, the inability to trust caregivers. I'm not paranoid, I saw the videos. Mrs. Sylvia showed me the backup files. You delete camera footage so Dad won't see how you really act when I'm supposed to be asleep. Julian's expression shifted from embarrassment to confusion. Videos? Ellie, what are you talking about? Brianna stepped closer to Julian, hand finding, his arm in a gesture looking supportive but feeling possessive. This is what I mean about fantasy thinking. Children with attachment trauma often create elaborate stories to explain insecurity feelings. But Ellie had spent too many nights listening to adults explain away truth she could see with her own eyes. She'd learned to recognize the particular cruelty of being told your reality wasn't real. She comes here at night when I'm supposed to be asleep. She brings wine and sits too close and touches you like you're her boyfriend. She tells you I'm broken so you'll think you need her to fix me. Ellie, that's enough. Julian's voice carried a warning that cracked her heart. He was choosing Brianna's authority over her desperate truth. She said, if I told you, you wouldn't want me anymore. She said, kids like me always make up stories. Because we're scared, but I'm not making this up, I have proof. What proof? Julian asked, tone suggesting he was humoring a hysterical child. Ellie ran to Mrs. Sylvia's desk, hands shaking as she pulled out the flash drive they'd prepared. The backup camera files. Mrs. Sylvia helped me find them. You can see everything. How she deletes recordings but forgets the backup server. She thrust the drive toward Julian, but Brianna interceded smoothly, hand closing over Ellie's wrist with surprising strength. Julian, this is exactly the elaborate manipulation I've been warning about, Brianna said, voice calm and clinical. Creating false evidence, involving household staff in delusions. These are serious red flags suggesting Ellie needs more help than either of us can provide. The word delusions hit Ellie like a slap. She'd heard it before, from other adults who found it easier to label children's inconvenient truths as mental illness. I'm not crazy, she screamed, yanking away from Brianna's grip. I'm not making it up. Why won't you believe me? Julian looked between his daughter's tear-streaked face and Brianna's concerned professionalism, and Ellie could see the exact moment he made his choice. The disappointment in his eyes was worse than anger. Ellie, I need you to go to your room. Now, we'll talk when you've calmed down. But Dad, now Ellie. The finality broke something inside her. She looked at Brianna's face and saw the tiny smile of triumph the woman couldn't quite hide. In that moment, Ellie understood she'd lost. Truth didn't matter if no one was willing to hear it. She dropped the flash drive and ran upstairs, small feet pounding like bullets from her breaking heart. Behind her, she could hear Brianna's soothing voice offering comfort to Julian, already spinning this confrontation into more evidence of Ellie's deteriorating mental state. In her room, Ellie pulled out the notebook she'd been keeping, pages filled with careful observations about their new life, drawings of the family she'd hoped they might become, pressed flowers from the garden where she'd imagined they might play. With deliberate, heartbroken precision, she began tearing out pages. Each rip was goodbye to dreams that had never had a chance, hopes poisoned by an adult who understood how to use love as a weapon. By the time Mrs. Sylvia found her 2 hours later, Ellie had retreated to her closet, surrounded by confetti of shredded dreams, clutching Leo as she sobbed with the abandon of a child who'd learned that sometimes telling truth only makes everything worse. Mrs. Sylvia gathered the sobbing girl and held her while she cried, making promises she wasn't sure she could keep about truth prevailing and love conquering all. But even as she spoke the words, she was planning her next move. Because some battles required more than children's courage and old women's intuition. Some battles required war. Watching innocent truth dismissed as lies is one of the cruelest betrayals. But Mrs. Sylvia isn't finished fighting for Ellie. Mrs. Sylvia Trent had worked for powerful men long enough to know that sometimes they needed saving from themselves. In 43 years of professional service, she'd learned that intelligent people could be remarkably stupid when emotions were involved. Julian Rivers was no exception. For 3 days after Ellie's devastating confrontation, Mrs. Sylvia watched her employer spiral deeper into Brianna's web. The psychologist had positioned the incident as a breakthrough moment, proving Ellie's need for intensive intervention. She'd increased visits, staying later each evening to support Julian through this difficult parenting challenge. Meanwhile, Ellie had stopped speaking almost entirely. She moved through the house like a ghost, completing routines with mechanical precision but engaging with no one. The vibrant, cautiously hopeful child who'd helped research camera footage had been replaced by a withdrawn stranger who flinched whenever Julian entered a room. It broke Mrs. Sylvia's heart. More than that, it ignited her fury. Wednesday evening, as Brianna's car pulled into the driveway for another emergency session, Mrs. Sylvia made her decision. She'd spent 3 days organizing evidence, cross-referencing timestamps, preparing a presentation that would make truth impossible to ignore. If Julian wouldn't listen to his daughter, perhaps he'd listen to cold, irrefutable facts. She waited until Brianna had been in the study with Julian for 30 minutes, long enough for manipulation to begin, not long enough to take hold completely. Then she knocked with brisk efficiency, perfected over decades of interrupting important meetings. "Mr. Rivers, I apologize for the interruption, but there's something urgent requiring your immediate attention." Julian looked up from the study couch, Brianna's hand resting on his shoulder in what she'd undoubtedly presented as supportive comfort. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. "Can it wait, Mrs. Sylvia? Mrs. Kessler and I are in the middle of—" "I'm afraid it cannot wait," Mrs. Sylvia interrupted, something she'd never done in 12 years. "This concerns Ellie's well-being directly, and given recent events, timing is critical." Brianna's smile remained perfect, but Mrs. Sylvia caught the flash of annoyance. "Of course, Mrs. Trent, though I should mention Ellie's current state is quite fragile. Any additional stress could exacerbate her condition." Mrs. Sylvia met Brianna's gaze steadily. "Indeed, which is why it's important to address the actual source of her distress." She moved to Julian's desk and opened her laptop, connecting it to his large monitor with movements sharp enough to cut glass. 3 days ago, Ellie made serious allegations that were dismissed as fantasy. "I believe you deserve to see the evidence she tried to present." Julian's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "Mrs. Sylvia, we discussed this. Ellie's trauma affects her perception of—" "Your daughter's perception is remarkably accurate," Mrs. Sylvia cut him off, fingers flying over keys. "As you're about to see." The first video appeared, time-stamp dated footage from 2 weeks prior. There was Brianna, positioned intimately close to Julian on the sofa, hands moving over his body in ways that had nothing to do with professional counseling and everything to do with seduction. Julian's face went pale. Where did this come from? The backup security server. The one that automatically saves everything even when someone deletes primary footage. Mrs. Sylvia's voice remained professionally neutral, but her eyes blazed. Someone has been systematically erasing main camera files during evening visits. Unfortunately for them, they weren't aware of the secondary backup system. She clicked to the next video, then the next. Each showed the same pattern. Brianna arriving after hours, positioning herself as Julian's emotional support, using physical intimacy to blur professional boundaries. The progression was clear and damning, a masterclass in emotional manipulation, captured in high definition. This is... Julian's voice trailed off as he watched himself on screen, seeing his vulnerability exploited with clinical precision.
This is evidence of systematic psychological manipulation, Mrs. Sylvia finished crisply. Textbook predatory behavior designed to isolate you from your daughter while creating emotional dependency. Brianna had gone very still, her mask of professional
concern finally slipping to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. These recordings were made without my consent. Using them this way could constitute harassment, even illegal surveillance. Mrs. Sylvia's smile was sharp as a blade. Actually, no. Every guest in this home signs a security waiver acknowledging the camera system. It's standard practice for high-profile households. I have your signed waiver in my files, dated from your first visit. She clicked to an audio file, enhanced using software Julian's company had developed. Brianna's voice filled the room, crystal clear despite background noise. As long as she is pushed out of the picture, everything will belong to me. He's completely dependent now. Thinks he can't parent without my guidance. A few more weeks and I'll have him convinced that sending her away is for everyone's best interest. The voice was unmistakably Brianna's, recorded during a phone conversation in the foyer while Julian was upstairs putting Ellie to bed. She'd thought herself safe from observation, had grown careless in her confidence. Julian's face went from pale to gray. When was this recorded? Last Tuesday. The night Ellie tried to tell you about the hugs. Mrs. Sylvia's voice was gentle, now filled with sympathy for a good man who'd been systematically deceived. Your daughter wasn't confused or paranoid, Julian. She was trying to protect you from someone who saw your kindness as weakness to be exploited. The silence was deafening. Julian stared at the monitor as if it contained his worst nightmare made manifest, which in many ways it did. Brianna sat, frozen, her carefully constructed facade finally shattered beyond repair. There's more, Mrs. Sylvia continued steadily. Financial records showing unusual consulting fees that don't match your actual agreement. Text messages to colleagues about securing her position in your household. A pattern of behavior going back to her previous employment. 3 different wealthy single fathers, all of whom experienced similar family disruptions before terminating her services. She'd spent sleepless nights researching Brianna's background, calling in favors from her late husband's legal contacts, building a case that would hold up in any court. Julian slowly turned to face Brianna, his expression transforming from confusion to something approaching horror. Is any of this true? For a moment, Brianna seemed to consider maintaining her act. Then something in Julian's face, perhaps the complete collapse of trust she'd worked so hard to build, made her realize the game was over. You don't understand, she said, her voice losing its practiced warmth and revealing something brittle underneath. I provided exactly what you needed. Guidance, support, emotional connection. That little girl was never going to give you what you really wanted. What I wanted was to be a good father, Julian said quietly, each word carrying the weight of profound betrayal. No, Brianna snapped, her mask finally falling completely away. What you wanted was someone to make you feel less alone. She's just a broken child who reminds you of your own failures. I offered you a real partnership, a chance at an actual relationship with someone who could match your intelligence and ambition. The ugly truth spilled out like poison from a lanced wound, her complete dismissal of Ellie as a human being worthy of love, her calculation that loneliness could be leveraged into control, her fundamental misunderstanding of what Julian truly valued. Mrs. Sylvia watched Julian's face as the full scope of deception became clear. She'd seen him navigate hostile corporate takeovers and cutthroat negotiations, but this personal betrayal was hitting him somewhere much deeper than professional pride. I think, Mrs. Sylvia said with crystalline clarity, it's time for you to leave, Mrs. Kessler. Security will escort you from the premises and ensure you understand that any attempt to contact this family again will result in legal action. Brianna stood shakily, her composure cracking into fragments. You're making a mistake, Julian. That child will never love you the way I could have. She'll always be damaged, always be someone else's leftover trauma that you're too guilty to reject. The cruelty of the words hung in the air like smoke, revealing exactly how little Brianna had ever understood about love, about family, about the fierce protectiveness that had been growing in Julian's heart despite his confusion. As security arrived to escort Brianna out, Julian remained seated, staring at the evidence of his own blindness, with the expression of a man watching, his world rearrange itself into a completely different shape. Mrs. Sylvia quietly closed her laptop and moved toward the door, giving him space to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Mrs. Sylvia, Julian's voice stopped her. Is Ellie? She's been waiting for you to see her clearly, the older woman replied softly. The question is whether you're finally ready to do that. Julian Rivers had built his fortune understanding that information was only as valuable as its application. Raw data meant nothing without wisdom to interpret it and courage to act. But as he sat in his study the morning after Brianna's exposure, surrounded by evidence of his spectacular failure in judgment, he wondered if he'd lost the ability to see clearly when it mattered most. Mrs. Sylvia's revelation had shattered more than his trust in Brianna. It had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that he'd been so desperate for connection, so terrified of failing as a father, that he'd allowed a predator to position herself between him and his daughter. But Julian hadn't become a successful CEO by wallowing in self-recrimination. He'd built his company on the principle that when systems failed, you fix them quickly, decisively, and publicly enough to prevent future failures. The emergency board meeting was called for 10 a.m. sharp. Julian had spent early morning hours, with his legal team, reviewing evidence Mrs. Sylvia had compiled and preparing for what he knew would be the most important presentation of his career, not because it would determine his company's future, but because it would determine his family's safety. Ellie remained locked in protective silence, moving through the house like a small ghost, haunted by adults who'd failed to believe her. Julian had tried to talk to her the night before, had knocked on her bedroom door with apologies burning in his throat. But she'd pretended to be asleep. The rejection cut deeper than any business loss he'd ever experienced. Now, as he stood before the conference room filled with his board of directors, investors, and senior executives, Julian felt the weight of more than corporate responsibility. He was fighting for his daughter's vindication, for her right to be believed, for the foundation of trust their relationship would need if they had any hope of becoming a real family. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents. "I've called this emergency meeting to address a serious security breach that has affected both my personal life and, by extension, our company's integrity." Mr. Martin Blake, the 70-year-old board member who'd never hidden his disapproval of Julian's decision to adopt Ellie, leaned forward with interest. Several other members exchanged glances, unsure what to expect from their typically private CEO. Julian activated the presentation system, and Brianna's image appeared on the large screen, a professional headshot from the psychological consulting firm they'd hired. She looked trustworthy, competent, exactly like someone you'd want helping your family through a difficult transition. "Dr. Brianna Kessler was retained 6 months ago to provide psychological support for my daughter's adjustment to our household," Julian continued, his tone clinical and controlled. "What we discovered yesterday is that Dr. Kessler has been conducting a systematic campaign of emotional manipulation designed to isolate my daughter and position herself as indispensable to our family unit." He clicked to the next slide, showing the timeline of Brianna's visits alongside corresponding gaps in their security footage. Dr. Kessler had been deleting primary camera recordings to hide her unprofessional conduct, unaware that our system maintains secondary backups. The evidence spans several months and includes audio recordings of her explicit intent to remove my daughter from our home. The room fell silent as Julian played selected clips, Brianna's predatory positioning during late-night conversations, her calculated touches designed to blur professional boundaries, and most damning of all, her recorded phone conversation about pushing Ellie out of the picture. Mr. Blake's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching horror. "Good God, Julian. How long was this going on?" "Long enough that my 8-year-old daughter tried to warn me," Julian replied, his voice heavy with regret. "Long enough that I dismissed her concerns as childhood fantasy because I trusted a professional's assessment over my own child's observations." He clicked to the next slide, showing Brianna's employment history. "Our investigation revealed this isn't an isolated incident. Dr. Kessler has worked with 3 other high-profile families in the past 5 years. In each case, she was terminated after family disruptions involving the children in their care. In 2 instances, the families went through lengthy custody disputes that benefited Dr. Kessler financially through extended consulting fees." The pattern was clear and damning. A predator who specialized in targeting vulnerable newly formed families, using professional credentials to gain access and trust, before systematically undermining the parent-child relationship. "The reason I'm sharing this with you," Julian continued, "is not just transparency about a personal matter. It's about the kind of company we are, the values we represent, and the protections we put in place for the families who trust us." Looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each board member, each investor who'd believed in his vision of using technology to build better connections between people. "My daughter tried to tell me the truth. An 8-year-old child saw through professional manipulation that fooled a room full of adults with advanced degrees. She tried to protect our family using nothing but her own courage and a grandmother's help with computer files. Julian's voice grew stronger, more certain. If we can't create a company culture that listens to inconvenient truths, that protects the vulnerable, that values honesty over convenience, then we have no business building technology that impacts families worldwide. He clicked to the final slide, which showed Ellie's drawing from her notebook. A picture she'd made of their family during the early days, when she'd still believed they might find their way to love each other. In the drawing, Julian was tall and strong, Ellie was smiling, and Mrs. Sylvia stood nearby like a protective guardian angel. "This is my daughter's vision of what our family could be," Julian said quietly. "Someone tried to destroy that vision by convincing me that my child's truth was fantasy, that her protection was paranoia. They nearly succeeded." Mr. Blake cleared his throat, his voice unusually gentle. "What do you need from us, Julian?" "I need you to understand that the decisions I make going forward will be influenced by what I've learned about the difference between being smart and being wise, between professional success and personal integrity. And I need you to know that any company policy, any business decision, any corporate direction that doesn't include listening to the people who are supposed to matter most is a direction we won't be taking." The vote to support Julian's personal security measures and establish stronger family protection protocols was unanimous. But more than that, Julian could see a shift in the room's energy, a recognition that their CEO had just shared something more valuable than quarterly projections or market analyses. He'd shared the lesson that power without wisdom, success without compassion, and intelligence without love were just sophisticated forms of failure. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Blake approached Julian with an expression he'd never seen on the older man's face, something that might have been respect mixed with regret. "I owe you an apology," Blake said quietly. "I thought emotional attachments made leaders weak. Your daughter just proved that emotional intelligence makes them stronger." Julian nodded, accepting the words while knowing that the only approval that truly mattered was waiting for him at home, if he was brave enough to earn it. The public exposure of Brianna's manipulation would send ripples through the professional community, protecting other families from similar predation. But for Julian, the real measure of justice wouldn't be found in legal consequences or professional sanctions. It would be found in whether an 8-year-old girl could learn to trust him again, and whether a man who'd built an empire could learn to be the father she deserved. The hallway outside Ellie's bedroom felt longer than usual as Julian stood there, holding a gift that carried the weight of his hopes and fears. In his hands was a new notebook, leather-bound, expensive, the kind he might have given to a business colleague. But written on the cover in his careful handwriting were words that had taken him 3 attempts to get right. "Continue writing. This time Dad will read every line." It had been 2 days since Brianna's exposure and removal from their lives. 2 days of Ellie moving through the house like a small, polite stranger who happened to share his address. She completed her routines with mechanical precision: breakfast, school, homework, dinner. But the spark of personality that had been slowly emerging over their months together had disappeared completely. Mrs. Sylvia had tried to counsel patience, reminding him that trust, once broken, required time and consistent action to rebuild. But Julian was discovering that patience came easier in boardrooms than in the heart of a man, watching his daughter disappear into protective silence. With the courage that had carried him through hostile corporate takeovers and impossible negotiations, Julian knocked softly on Ellie's door. "Ellie, it's Dad. I have something for you." Silence stretched for so long that Julian wondered if she'd fallen asleep or was simply choosing not to respond. Then he heard the soft whisper of bare feet on carpet, and the door opened just wide enough for one dark eye to peer out at him. "Hi," he said softly, crouching down to meet her at eye level. "I brought you something." Ellie's gaze moved to the notebook in his hands, taking in the words written on the cover. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but Julian caught the flicker of interest she couldn't quite hide. "It's a new journal," he explained, extending it toward her. I know you tore up your old one. I thought maybe you might want to start again. She opened the door wider but didn't take the notebook immediately. Why? The simple question carried more weight than any business negotiation Julian had ever faced. Why should she trust him again? Why should she believe his words after he'd chosen a stranger's lies over her truth? Because I was wrong, Julian said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Because you tried to tell me the truth and I didn't listen. Because I let someone convince me that your courage was confusion and your protection was paranoia. Ellie studied his face with those two old eyes that had learned to read adult expressions for survival clues. Mrs. Kessler said you might send me away if I kept telling stories. The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Ellie, sweetheart, I need you to understand something very important. Nothing, absolutely nothing you could ever say or do would make me send you away. You're my daughter. That's not a temporary arrangement or a trial period. That's forever. She said foster kids always get sent back when they become too much trouble. Julian's heart shattered a little more with each word. Brianna had used Ellie's deepest fear against her, weaponizing the trauma of abandonment that every foster child carried like invisible scars. The only person getting sent away was the person who lied to both of us, Julian said firmly. Mrs. Kessler was the trouble, not you. She was the one who didn't belong in our family. Ellie was quiet for a long moment, processing his words with the careful consideration of someone who'd learned that adult promises were fragile things that broke easily under pressure. I saw the videos, she said finally. Mrs. Sylvia showed me. Mrs. Kessler was always touching you and making you sad. You were trying to protect me, Julian realized, the full weight of his daughter's courage finally hitting him. You saw what was happening and tried to warn me, even though you were scared I wouldn't believe you. Ellie nodded, tears finally spilling over. I was scared you'd pick her instead of me. Grown-ups always pick other grown-ups. Julian opened his arms, hardly daring to hope, and felt his heart restart when Ellie stepped forward into his embrace. She was so small, so brave, so much wiser than the adults who were supposed to be protecting her. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair, holding her with the fierce protectiveness he should have shown from the beginning. I'm so sorry I didn't. Listen, I'm sorry I let her make you feel unsafe in your own home. I'm sorry I failed you when you needed me most. They stayed like that for a long time, father and daughter holding each other in the hallway while 8 months of careful distance finally collapsed into something that might eventually become love. When Ellie finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clearer than they'd been in days. Will you really read my notebook? She asked, taking the journal from his hands and running her fingers over the cover. Every word, Julian promised. And if there are things I don't understand, will you help me learn? Ellie's smile was small but real. Okay, but I might write about things you don't like. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. Julian thought about everything they'd been through, about how close he'd come to losing her to his own blindness and fear. Uncomfortable truths are still better than comfortable lies, he said. I promise to listen even when it's hard. Ellie opened the notebook to the first blank page and looked up at him. Can I write about how Mrs. Kessler made me feel? And how scared I was that you'd believe her instead of me? Yes, Julian said without hesitation. Write about all of it. Your feelings matter and your perspective matters, and I want to understand everything I missed. For the first time since Brianna had entered their lives, Julian felt like he could see his daughter clearly, not as a project to be managed or a problem to be solved, but as a complete person with wisdom and courage and love to offer, if he was brave enough to receive it. As Ellie settled onto her bed with the new notebook, Julian realized that learning to be a father wasn't about having all the answers or never making mistakes. It was about listening when your child spoke truth, believing them when they trusted you with their fears and choosing their well-being over your own comfort every single time. The door to Ellie's room stayed open that night, and Julian could hear the soft scratch of her pen against paper as she began to write their story again, this time with a father who was finally ready to read every word. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in the quiet spaces between heartbreak and healing. But every family story needs an ending that shows what love looks like when it's finally ready to grow. 3 weeks later, the Rivers house felt different. Not just quieter without Brianna's manipulative presence, but lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted that none of them had realized they'd been carrying. The change was most visible, in small moments. Ellie humming softly while she did homework, Julian pausing his work to ask about her day without it feeling forced, Mrs. Sylvia smiling more often as she moved through her daily routines. On a Saturday morning filled with autumn, sunshine, Mrs. Sylvia found herself drawn to the living room by the sound of quiet conversation. What she discovered there made her pause in the doorway, not wanting to disturb a moment that felt too precious to interrupt. Julian and Ellie were sprawled on the carpet beside the coffee table, surrounded by an explosion of art supplies. Colored, pencils, markers, and sheets of drawing paper covered every available surface, while Leo the teddy bear sat propped against a couch cushion like a furry supervisor overseeing their creative collaboration. "No, Dad, you're holding the crayon wrong," Ellie was saying, her voice filled with the gentle authority of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. "You have to press lighter if you want the colors to blend together." Julian adjusted, his grip with exaggerated concentration, his tongue poking out slightly in a way that made him look remarkably like his daughter. "Like this?" "Better," Ellie nodded approvingly. "Now try making the sky part. But remember, real skies aren't just blue. They have purple and pink and orange, especially when the sun is setting." Mrs. Sylvia watched as Julian attempted to follow his daughter's artistic direction, creating a sunset that was enthusiastic if not technically proficient. His drawing looked like something a kindergartner might produce, all bright colors and awkward proportions. But Ellie was studying it with the seriousness of an art critic evaluating a masterpiece. "It's good," she declared finally. "You're getting better at listening to the colors." "Listening to the colors?" Julian repeated, clearly charmed by the phrase. "Colors talk to each other," Ellie explained matter-of-factly. "You just have to pay attention to what they're saying. Purple likes to whisper next to yellow, but orange likes to shout next to red." Julian nodded as if this made perfect sense, which Mrs. Sylvia supposed it did in the language that was developing between father and daughter. A vocabulary built on attention and acceptance, rather than authority and assumption. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Julian following Ellie's gentle corrections as she taught him about shading and proportion. Mrs. Sylvia noticed that Ellie's new notebook lay open beside them, filled with drawings and words that chronicled their journey from careful strangers to something approaching a real family. "Dad?" Ellie's voice was casual, but Mrs. Sylvia caught the undertone of something more serious. Julian was concentrating on coloring inside the lines of a flower that looked suspiciously like a purple octopus. "I wrote something in my notebook that I want to read to you, is that okay?" Julian's hand stilled on his drawing. Over the past weeks, Ellie had shared pieces of her writing, observations about Mrs. Sylvia's kindness, descriptions of school friends, stories about dreams she'd had. But this request felt different, weighted with importance. "Of course," he said, setting down his crayon and giving her his full attention. Ellie reached for the notebook, flipping through pages covered with her careful handwriting and small illustrations. She found what she was looking for and cleared her throat with the solemnity of someone about to deliver important news. "It's called Things I Learned About Hugs," she announced, then began to read in her clear, young voice. "Some hugs are safe and some hugs are scary, but the scariest hugs are the ones that pretend to be safe." Mrs. Kessler gave lying hugs. They looked nice, but they were trying to steal things, Dad's attention and my family and the trust we were building together. I learned that a wrong hug sometimes teaches us how to choose the right ones. Dad's hugs used to feel careful, like he was afraid I might break. Now they feel like he wants to keep me safe, which is different. Mrs. Sylvia's hugs feel like home cookies and warm blankets. They don't want anything except to make me feel better. Leo's hugs are the best because teddy bears never lie and never want anything except to be loved. But I think Dad's hugs might become my favorite, because they're getting braver every day. And brave hugs are the best kind of safe hugs. The silence that followed Ellie's reading was profound. Julian's eyes had filled with tears that he didn't bother to hide, and Mrs. Sylvia found herself pressing a hand to her heart, overwhelmed by the wisdom contained in such a young voice. "Ellie," Julian said softly, "that's beautiful. And you're right. My hugs were scared before. I was afraid I'd do it wrong, or that you wouldn't want them, or that I wasn't the kind of dad who deserved to give them." "And now?" Ellie asked, closing the notebook and moving closer to him. "Now I know that hugs aren't about being perfect," Julian said, opening his arms. "They're about being real." Ellie settled into his embrace with the easy trust that had taken months to build and seconds to shatter, but was somehow rebuilding itself stronger than before. Julian held her close, his chin resting on top of her head, both of them surrounded by the colorful chaos of their morning art session. Mrs. Sylvia stepped quietly into the room, no longer able to resist being part of this moment that felt like witnessing something sacred. "Well," she said, her voice warm with affection, "it looks like someone has been doing some very important work this morning." "We're drawing our family," Ellie explained, pulling back from Julian's hug but staying close to his side. "Dad's not very good at it yet, but he's learning." "The best kind of learning," Mrs. Sylvia agreed, settling into her favorite chair where she could observe their artistic collaboration. "And what have you learned, Mr. Rivers?" Julian looked down at his daughter, then at the notebook that had become the chronicle of their journey toward understanding each other. "I've learned that 8-year-olds see things more clearly than 33-year-olds sometimes, and that the most important conversations happen when you're paying attention to colors and sharing crayons." Ellie beamed at this assessment, then picked up a fresh sheet of paper. "Want to draw Mrs. Sylvia with us? I know exactly what color she is." "Oh my," Mrs. Sylvia laughed. "I'm not sure I want to know what colors I am." "Silver and gold and deep blue," Ellie said promptly. "The colors of someone who keeps secrets safe and makes everything better just by being there." As the three of them settled into their art project, Mrs. Sylvia reflected on how much had changed since that terrible evening when Brianna's lies had nearly destroyed the fragile family they were building. Love, she realized, wasn't about perfection or knowing all the right things to say. It was about showing up, paying attention, and choosing to believe in each other even when, especially when, it was difficult. Outside, the autumn sun continued, its gentle arc across the sky, painting the drawing room in shades of gold and amber. Inside, a millionaire, his daughter and their guardian angel created masterpieces with crayons and built a family with patience, one honest conversation at a time. In her new notebook, Ellie had written, "Not everyone who hugs is worth keeping, but the people who earn the right kind of hugs are worth everything." And in the quiet contentment of their Saturday morning, surrounded by art supplies and filled with hope, all three of them knew she was absolutely right. What started as a whisper in the darkness became a voice strong enough to save a family. Ellie's courage to speak truth when adults wouldn't listen reminds us that sometimes the smallest people carry the biggest wisdom. Her father learned that real love means believing in your child's voice even when, especially when, the world tells you not to. In our own lives, we all encounter moments when we must choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths. We face people who use manipulation disguised as care, who exploit our vulnerabilities while claiming to heal them. But we also have the power to listen to the voices that matter most, to protect the relationships that deserve our protection, and to build families, whether biological or chosen, on foundations of trust and authentic love. If this story touched your heart, if you recognize the courage it takes to speak truth in a world that often prefers silence, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video to help other families discover these important lessons, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the wisdom of children and the power of choosing love over convenience. Because in the end, the most important hugs aren't the ones that feel comfortable, they're the ones that feel true. And truth, no matter how young the voice that speaks it, is always worth protecting. What whispers have you been ignoring? What truths are waiting for you to be brave enough to hear them? The conversation starts with you.